Welcome to the SRS Podcast. I'm your host, Aaron J. Babyar, and I'm the Training Director of Support Raising Solutions. Whether you're a new ministry worker or a veteran looking to increase your competence and confidence, Support Raising Solutions seeks to bless you in your quest to be a spiritually healthy, vision-driven, fully funded Great Commission worker. My guest today is a third time, I'm not sure what, guest here on our podcast, but Jenn Fortner is with us today. And Jenn, welcome back, my friend. I'm glad you could be on the SRS podcast once again.
Yeah, thanks. I always look forward to it. Love talking with you, Aaron, and you guys as well.
What number of podcast is this for you?
I think it's 3, maybe 4. I think it's 3.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I know you're a friend of SRS, and we've talked off and on for years. And I wasn't sure at what point that we started getting you onto the podcast, but I've been excited to record this particular topic for a while now. And so before we dig into that, real quickly, kind of remind everybody a little bit about who you are and where you are in the world and what you get to do for the Great Commission.
Yeah, sure. So I work mainly with Assemblies of God World Missions, and I teach our missionaries in the area of support raising. I do training and coaching for a pretty large number of folks who are going overseas in their assignments for the first time ever. So I am fortunate in that I get to meet people all over the country and get to share their experience with them, coach them up, train them, get them in best practices as far as support raising goes, and see them off to their first assignment. So I'm super blessed.
Yeah. Very cool. Yeah, I know you do some coaching. You're pretty gifted at that. The reason, though, I wanted to talk to you specifically on this podcast was to talk about leaving well. And to explain that a bit, of course, I'm going to summarize your story just briefly for the listeners, and then we can begin filling in some gaps. But I don't know, it's probably, Jenn, I think it was 3 or 4 years ago, you and I were talking about something related to raising support, and you shared that there had been a time when you had actually left support. I think you were getting married. This is well over 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. You were going to get married, and then you ended up going back on support. But what grabbed me was because when you left support, you didn't just like quit and walk away, but you had a plan and you had a strategy, and you left support, but you left it well, and you had some great commission vision to how you did that. And so I want to just kind of talk about that a little bit. You can get into some numbers, or maybe you want to carve out the narrative a bit more. But at the time when you realized that you were going to be stepping away from living and working in a position that was support based, how many supporters were on your team? Do you recall?
It was around probably 50, I would say, around 50, 55, something like that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And where did you get the idea? And we'll unpack what you did, but where did you get the idea? Or what inspired you to leave so well in the way that you left?
Yeah, well, as I was, I got the idea as I was transitioning from the work that I was doing with the organization I was with at the time, that my ministry partners weren't just invested in me at this point as a person. They were really invested in the ministry that I was a part of. And throughout the years of supporting me, they got to know the organization. They got to know what I was doing. And of course, me as well as a person. People give to people above a cause. But, they were ultimately into the cause as well because they were into me. So I really decided at that point, okay, I'm not just going to exit and say, hey, thanks for the time. Thanks for the season that you've been with me. I really wanted to leave those partnerships well. So I started by having appointments with several of my partners and just sitting down with them and not asking for support. Obviously, I was transitioning at that point. But really just telling them thank you and, buying them a cup of coffee or dinner or whatever and just saying, hey, couldn't have done this without you. I really appreciate it. Here's what I'm doing next. And as I was having those appointments, Aaron, like pretty early on, I would say like into like my probably third or fourth time doing that with some of my partners. One of my partners is actually her idea. She said to me, Jen, I'm so excited for you and what God's, the path that you're on, but my heart is for this ministry. Do you have any friends that you could recommend me to put my support to?
That's
And
awesome.
a light bulb just went on for me. And I was like, oh my goodness, I do. So I can't say it was my idea. It was one of my supporters' ideas. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, I will say though, that is not a common idea. In fact, and I've shared this with you before.
Uh-huh.
I really kind of had my heart broken. It was probably at least 3 or 4 years ago. I was consulting, for lack of a better term, with an older gentleman who was leaving a good ministry, and he had actually been fully funded for years, but they were a little weak on some policy things, and
Uh-huh.
there was multiple people within the organization that he was leaving an executive position in, where there's a lot of people that weren't funded. They weren't even, I mean, forget fully funded. Some of them probably weren't half funded. And I really kind of innocently said, so are you gonna hand off some of your supporters and introduce them? And he looked at me like I was crazy. And I was like, well, wouldn't you want to do that? He goes, well, they're my supporters. And I was
Hmm.
like, well, yeah, but you're leaving the ministry. They're like, it's great that you have personal ownership and you should, but then also maybe these people will continue to pray for and give to other people that are carrying on the torch that you're passing. And I
Right.
mean, I might as well have been speaking a different language. Like that was so like outside of his comfort zone. And he's like, well, no, they don't know those people. And I was like, I know. I was thinking maybe you'd be introducing them. And he's like, oh no, I could never do that. And like there was this coldness. I hate to use that word, but I think that's true. There was this coldness and this closure to, this is my support team. They're supporting me up until the age of retirement, and they can't give to anybody else because then they would be somebody else's team. This was my team. I'm just shutting it down. Now, again,
Hmm.
I'm putting words into his mouth. He didn't say those things, but I had that conversation not too long from the time that I had the conversation with you, Jen, and hearing how you really handed off your support team. You left well and you handed them off to others, and it just, you inspired me years ago. So that's a good thing. And also it kind of broke my heart because I met somebody who was doing the exact opposite
Hmm.
of what you were doing. So that's why I've been kind of chomping at the bit to get you back on the podcast just to talk about this, because it sounds like a supporter kind of turned on a light bulb for you, so to speak, and you started going, no, wait a minute. There's a way to leave better. I mean, I'm putting words in your mouth, but don't you think that's kind of what you were
Oh,
wanting?
absolutely. And, at that point, Aaron, I knew that it was probably 80 to 90 to 100% likely that at some point I would return back to the ministry. So, and I think that's an important point, even for people that, leave well and say, I still have a calling on me. Who knows what's going to happen in the future? But I knew that the Lord was saying to me, don't worry about that right now. What you need to do is point these people in a direction. I will take care of you in the long run. So
Mm,
what I did is, Aaron, I had a coworker that was working with me at the time who she was from India and hadn't been in the States that long and was an amazing believer, hard worker, just didn't know very many people in her life back. Her parents back in India were Hindu priests. And so her whole family, her whole network and community back in her homeland was not Christian, wasn't
mm,
very supportive of what she was doing. So she was stuck between a rock and a hard place, going,
yeah,
I know I'm called to ministry, but I don't know how this is going to happen. I haven't been here very long to make a ton of connections. And
right,
so as
right.
soon as my supporter said to me, do you have anybody? She instantly came to mind. And
Mm,
as I prayed through that, and of course I directed my supporter right in front of me to her and connected those dots, but then I decided, you know what? I am going to talk to all of my supporters about my friend Gaia 3, and
awesome.
I am going to make it my mission in the midst of this to not only leave well and say thank you for your support, but also find a way to fund my friend
Yeah.
who was in a rock and a hard place. So
Wow. Well, I do not want to underplay some really significant things within that. One is, though they were your quote unquote personal support team, you saw a connection to the grander vision for the
Mhm.
kingdom of God. So they were yours. You had ownership, but not insofar as that you would just be stuck on that. Like you saw that there was an ability for people to be connected to kingdom work, whether you were involved with it or not. So that's one point. I
Yeah,
think
one
another
of
point there is you're looking out for your fellow man. You're looking out
the,
for your fellow sister in ministry that was doing good work and seeing her needs, and you're like, oh wait a minute, I can do this. And then thirdly, and definitely not least, Jen, I so appreciate you realized that this was an opportunity and it
mhm.
was going to be time consuming, but you did it. And instead of just sending out a newsletter that says, hey everybody, thanks again for supporting me, I'm moving, I'm getting married, I'm living somewhere else, or whatever it is you had to
Right.
say, you actually sought people out and relationally attempted a handoff, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think, it's important if you really believe that your support team is just as vital of a part of the Great Commission as you are as senders, I think that it's important to realize that you treat them that way no matter what. If you're leaving, you're going, you're coming, whatever it is. And, the second thing that I realized in the midst of that is, well, maybe it is a chance. So, like these 50 people that I'm handing off or asking to hand off if they want to, may fulfill their support and their stewardship goals by supporting Gayatri now instead of myself. But ultimately, I know that God is my provider, and he's got the provision for the vision way greater than I do. He wants me to be in ministry and to fulfill my calling probably way more than I do. So of course
Mm-hmm.
he's going to be with me in this journey, and I know that he is going to ultimately provide that
Yeah.
bit of partnership that I'm going to need in the future if that were to happen, which it ended up happening.
Yeah.
Where I needed I talked to some of those partners again, and guess what, Aaron?
What?
They supported Gayatri, and then they said, of course we're going to jump back on your team, of
Oh
course.
wow.
And
Wow.
so I think that, and maybe not all of them, but I think the vast majority did. So
So over
it's
time they actually increased their partnership in the gospel.
yes, absolutely. And I think that, we hold things so, oh, I can't give this away because I don't know what's going to happen. But if we're living in that kingdom mindset that it's all into the Lord anyway,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not about me, it's about the Great Commission. It's about what the Lord wants to do in the earth and telling people about Jesus and the greater vision, and not just limited to myself. I think that makes all of the difference. And when you hold things loosely before the
Yeah.
Lord, it makes so much of a difference compared to sort of trying to engineer all of it.
Well, very, very well done. So I'm going to ask you to walk us through some of the steps that you learned, because
Mhm.
my guess is that we have some people who are listening to this podcast. Either they found it on their own, or perhaps their supervisor or a friend sent it to them and said, "Hey, you need to listen to this since you're transitioning." So these are maybe some opportunities to kind of inspire people, quote unquote, leaving well. But I will say this: it takes time, and so in a scenario that's theoretical, that you're going to be winding down your ministry calendar for whatever reason at the end of the month, you might want to plan your calendar in such a way where either you wind down a little earlier or you stay around a little longer, just for this. Really, it can be a time consuming process of trying to connect the dots, of handing off your supporters to be able to support others, to partner others that are doing the
Mhm.
vision. So I don't want to lose that, because I think what might happen for some people, Jen, is they go, oh yeah, I could totally do that. And then they don't actually make that time exist in their calendar, and they're distracted by other things. So just a
Right.
word of warning to people. This takes time. It's work. Also, it's totally worthy. It's worth your time and effort to hand off your supporters, so to speak, to others that are working for the Great Commission. So, Jen, walk us through a little bit of little steps that people should be aware of if they're
Yeah.
if they're headed
Yeah.
towards leading well.
Well, I think number one, is kind of just what you said. Sure, it takes time, but I think when exiting or transitioning from current ministry, don't just merely send a newsletter out personally connect with as many team members as you can as possible before sending that newsletter. Of course, send a newsletter, but thank them for their faithfulness. And again, it's that mindset, it's that perspective that they are just as vital in the Great Commission as you are as a worker by, praying and giving. And so you give them that time. And here's the deal, Aaron, is if you're trying to transition somebody else, like somebody else's partnership to somebody else, I'm not saying that well, but you know what I'm saying.
To
But
someone new.
yes, someone, thank you for helping me with that. But if you're doing that, okay, that's not going to take you any more time than if you were just meeting with people to say thank you anyway. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so I really do think that that's the way to go whenever possible, is personally connect, as relational as possible. Just like you began the process, you should finish well, by not just sending out a newsletter and saying, I'm peacing out, thank you, but
Right.
really taking the time to relationally connect with people and tell them thank you and share what the Lord has done while you've been in ministry, share what's happening in the future, and do that as much face-to-face as possible.
Right.
So that's number
Right.
one.
Okay.
Number two, when contacting your team members, just ask if they'd be interested in transitioning their giving to one of your coworkers. If they say yes, I think that it's important to schedule a time that all of you can sit down together as you're able, if possible. And if that doesn't work out with your schedule, I think that there's some things that you can do to connect the dots for them relationally, such as like sending a joint email or getting on a 3-way call or a Zoom meeting or whatever to introduce these folks together. But your role would basically be at that point to introduce each party and share appropriate details connecting them in relationships. So that's kind of
Right.
number two.
Okay. Okay. Good. All right. So these are hopefully these are making progressive sense to people. There's kind of an order to
Mm-hmm.
all this. All right.
Mm-hmm.
Carry on.
So, and obviously, take the time as you're transitioning out to pray about what coworker or coworkers in the ministry that could use the additional support, or who you feel like God's laying on your heart.
Yeah.
And then, if you do have a specific coworker in mind, like I did with my friend Gayatri, you prep that person prior to your asking for your supporters. And I think that, that's kind of, you know, easy
Yeah.
to understand, but I think it is important to let your coworker know your intention to ask your financial partners to transition to giving with them. And then as you communicate with your coworker that your expectation, and here's a kicker, is for them to build fruitful relationships with your new financial partner.
Absolutely.
Because you don't want to give your financial partners over to somebody that's not going to steward that well.
Right.
So
Yeah. I
you're
can imagine that you had a nice conversation. I'm sure Gayatri is a wonderful person, and you probably
mhm.
didn't have to say this, but to some degree, you said, "Hey, don't treat my former supporter, who's now going to be your new supporter. Don't treat them like a cash machine. Like, you
Yeah.
need to get coffee with them. You need to build a relationship with them. I'm handing them to you on a platter, but you need to take it from here." Right?
Yeah, and you want to make sure that you're not going to transfer your financial partners, all of those relationships that you've built, and even if you feel like you might have a long-term call that may materialize later, you don't want to give that to somebody who is not going to relationally invest in them. So,
Right.
yeah.
Right. Okay. Good.
And I think that's the main stuff. And then obviously you got to, understand the protocol and guidelines with your sending organization to transfer their giving, and know how that all works, and what needs to happen there. And yeah, I think that's kind of the main stuff. But really,
It's a great
that
overview.
perspective that your financial partners aren't yours, they're God's.
Hmm.
And it's truly not about you. It's about
Hmm.
the ministry. It's about what God's doing on the earth. So,
Hmm. If I could add one thought, it would just be that, or reemphasize, because you already said it, but yeah, really be praying about who God might have you connect. I have some neighbors actually that years ago, like, or I'm talking like at the fence line, right? Like,
mhm.
look over the fence and they're like, "Hey, we got a bunch of money to give. Where should we give it? Missionaries." Like, it was that,
Mhm.
it was that sort of a conversation, like totally caught me out of the blue. And, selfishly, I could have quickly went, "Well, here you go. Here's my giving link." Right. But I was praying about it in the morning, or I was praying about it at the time. And the next day, I gave them a link for somebody that was completely outside of my organization, where I was just like, hey, I think relationally, I think you're going to connect with what this couple is doing. And it's a couple, different country, different organization, but the Holy Spirit just led me to connecting them. And then I was out of it. Like, so I really can't take any credit for that. God just like superintended that whole conversation. But what's awesome is they have now become friends with these friends of mine, and they connect completely separately. And I think they're one of their stronger supporters on a regular basis. And I also feel like, and I love this couple, but I think it might have been weird if I would have had them start supporting me living right next to them. Not that there would have been anything wrong with that, but there was just a real natural how the Holy Spirit led to hand them to somebody even outside of my organization. And so as the listeners are thinking and praying, there might be some great connections with people that are working on these very specific same kingdom-minded ministry work that you are, but also perhaps you have some supporters that might relationally, spiritually, whatever else, connect with the work that somebody else is doing for the Great Commission that your organization doesn't. And that's okay. Make those connections. Wouldn't you say, Jen?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Being a conduit of, in that connection with the Lord and mining that out in your own inner life, it may look a little different, and that's fine. So,
yeah. Well, great stuff. I will tell our listeners that it's been a while. In fact, I think it's been 3, 4, or 5 years now since you blogged about this. But Jen, I know you have a website, and I got it right this time. I think I killed it last time I had you on the podcast or referred to it. It's JennFortner.com, JennFortner.com. And there was an article where you wrote about this years ago, and you entitled the article, "Ultimately, It's Not About You." So I'm sure if somebody were to get on your website and look for that, they could find some of this in more written form. And also, if people want to get a hold of you or ask questions, you have an about/contact link on there as well. So JennFortner.com is where you would go to find out more about Jen and her blog and some of her good stuff. So, Jen, hopefully I promoted what you're doing well there. Anything to add or final words on this topic today?
No, thanks for having me. And I'm super excited to, if somebody does this and somebody gets new supporters because of it, I just think that that's such a win. So I'm really happy to have this discussion.
Yeah. Praise the Lord. Thank you for modeling this for us. And thank you for being a part of the SRS podcast.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us for this episode. We would love to hear your ideas for future content. Please visit supportraisersolutions.org/feedback to share your thoughts and questions. Also, wherever you download your podcast from, be sure to subscribe for future episodes and come back each week to gain more insight into the process of building and maintaining your personal support team.